Well, good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly Wednesday webinar series. My name is Brett Patel. I'm the Vice President of Advancement here at the National Hemophilia Foundation. Today's webinar will discuss hemophilia gene therapy value assessment, methodological challenges and recommendations. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We have NHF staff members monitoring these questions, which we will present to our speaker after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to the community beginning on Friday, January 7th. Today, we will also be live streaming on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels. I'm joined today by Dr. Lou Garrison from the University of Washington. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Garrison, and I'll now turn it over to you. Get us started, sir.
Great. Thanks so much for the invitation from the NHF and Brett for helping me get set up here. Let me give a little background on myself. I'm a health economist. I have no clinical or patient experience with hemophilia, so everyone in the audience actually understands the disease better than I do. But I've had the good fortune to meet Mark Skinner, I would say 5 years ago, and then over the years, I've worked in a variety of areas in health economics, and this is one of the areas that I've had some involvement. And I was invited to talk about a paper that a group of us recently published. So I'll provide some background to that, but that's really my focus is that paper, which is available. And if you can access it, I'll give you my email at the end, so feel free to reach out to me. In terms of disclosures, I've received consulting fees from a number of companies working in the hemophilia area and also just rare disease in general. I'm presenting my views and not necessarily those of my co-authors. This is really a consensus publication. I'm the first listed, but not really the lead author. It's a group of us who are really the lead, and it's a multidisciplinary group with some clinicians and economists and payers and so on, if you read the list. So again, that's a disclaimer. Now, I approach this very much as the economists, and this is the focus for me is we had these gene therapies, or they go under a wide range of names, and I'm not making any real distinctions here. I was involved in an NIH meeting last June on something called gene-targeted therapies, cell and gene therapies, advanced therapies, transformative therapies. So lots of, at this point, we're still a lot of synonyms being used for these. But the interesting thing from an economic point of view, and maybe clinical, is they involve a one-time, maybe a few treatments, but a short series of upfront treatments, and they can produce very substantial health gains. And I use the term health gains as kind of a proxy for a combination of life extension, length of life, and quality of life that occur over many years. So the health gain can be quite large compared to many chronic therapies that we're on. For example, I'm on I've been taking atorvastatin and Lipitor for a long time. There is the projected health gain is small, but a large, it's the most prescribed drug in America. So, at a population level, are going to have a big impact. But for these sort of in rare populations, these gene therapies are focusing on relatively small populations, and the value can be quite large. But there are tremendous uncertainties at launch for a variety of reasons that we'll go into that make it difficult to assess that value. So from the economist point of view, the questions I'm interested in are, how do we finance these payments, which we're not going to go into in any depth, and are we providing an appropriate reward or incentive for innovation in this area, and how do we determine that reward? And that's really what our paper gets into. So let me start off. I got dividing this into 4 sections. One, some background on just some general economic challenges of gene therapy. Some background on how economists think about value, and I'm calling it economic value for that reason. Then the next section, I'll go through the key recommendations of this consensus paper. I'll stop there and we can have questions. And if there's time, I can go into some broader issues for value assessment frameworks. So let me begin. And again, Brett is monitoring the Q&A, and I'm fine to be interrupted and to have a discussion at any point. Okay, I think you're all probably aware, and this is amazing science. And I guess I should point it out. I'm at the University of Washington. I'm trained as a health economist. I've been here 17 years. For 12 years before that, I worked at Syntex and then Roche Pharmaceuticals. Worked on particularly a lot on personalized medicine and thinking about paying for diagnostics and so on. Prior to that, I worked in nonprofit research at Project Hope and and Battelle, both research organizations. And I'm a former president of I'll refer to ISPOR, the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. We have 20,000 members in over 100 countries. So there's a lot of interest in these things all over the world. And so that should give you some idea. And I started out in my Project Hope days. I remember teaching health economics in Poland in 1989. So I've been at this for a long time, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But I was always, and I remember sitting in 2001 being in a meeting at Roche that we were really trying to get personalized medicine going with the idea of linking a diagnostic to a therapeutic, and it's really taken a long time to make those things happen. But in the last few years, really driven by the science, I think, we've seen the advent of cell and gene therapy. As you can see in this diagram, there's just a tremendous number of products in development. So the incentives are there, but it's really kind of driven by the science that has happened. The science in other areas like personalized medicine has maybe been more difficult. Now, this is a slide from a presentation I've been invited to give at the end of the month at this GHAL summit. And I won't go into it in any detail, but this shows some of the gene therapies that are in the hemophilia area, that there are just a number of companies and a large number of companies and trials in both the hemo A area on the hemo B on hemo A on the left and hemo B on the right. So the science, this ability to do adeno-associated viruses, that technology, and I guess our improved scientific understanding has really allowed us to sort of become aggressive as a global scientific enterprise and clinical enterprise to engage in these trials. Okay, but again, you can see there at various phases, and there's just a lot of activity. Now, when we think about rare diseases, this is from a report, by the Lewin Group, and they've states here that there are over 7,000 rare diseases affecting 30 million Americans. So about 1/10 of Americans have a rare disease, and they estimate the burden at $966 billion. So almost $1 trillion. And you can see they're not just calculating medical costs. A large part of the burden is non-medical costs on the left, indirect costs, absenteeism, presenteeism, caregiver burden, and things like that. So, it's a big target. It's a substantial burden, and the fact that we have the science progressing should be encouraging to all of us. Now, when I look at it as an economist, and I should point out, I mean, probably I've thought most about the drugs for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and had some involvement in some analysis around gene therapy and the BioMarin product, which I mentioned at the beginning. But you can see here on atorvastatin on the left, the quality gain, the length of life and quality of life, is less than one for any individual. So that's the expected gain I'll get. Honestly, I'll never know if I live longer, if that was the reason or not. Now but over to the right, you can see that at least for the children who have type 1 SMA would be expected to die within 2 years. And so if we can save them, they're going to gain, very large health gains. And so that's, from a standpoint of thinking about the value of that, it's a large number, and it's upfront. And the same is true of this, the middle drug there, which was one of the early one for retinal disorder. So the difference is these gene therapies create this tremendous value up front. So I would say it's not that they cost a lot because they create great value up front, and we want to reward that value. It's not that the high cost is an inherent aspect of the medicine. I mean, the costs are that we've spent billions of dollars to develop these medicines. And once we get them, oftentimes the marginal cost of making them is low, but we want to reward that innovation. Now, I'm going to talk about an organization called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is a nonprofit private organization in the US. And they've sort of stepped to the forefront, and I'll talk more about this, in estimating the sort of cost effectiveness in terms of what's the incremental cost for an additional quality adjusted life year gain, QALY. And we can come back to people's reservations about the QALY in the discussion, but that is the metric that our field has adopted to allow some ability to compare across products. And I just put this slide up to point out that there's a range of cost per QALY in the gene therapies that have entered the market. These are the early list here, and they're ranging from being relatively, here's one for nusinersen estimated at 790,000 per quality. But, this emicizumab in patients without inhibitors was projected to be cost saving. And Valrox for hemophilia A was projected to be cost saving and improvement, what would in economics we would call dominant. So, there is potential economic value here. So let me go back to what I mean by economic value. And, again, value itself is an ambiguous term with different meanings in different contexts. And I'll use the term context for the main one I think about is, say, the regulatory context of the Food and Drug Administration or the EMA, and the Health Technology Assessment Agency. Now, unlike the UK, which has the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, NICE, we don't have a national HTA body. We had the Office of Technology Assessment 30 years ago, but that was disbanded for political reasons, and we're still in active discussion about what we need to do. Now, ICER has emerged as a nonprofit private entity to supply HTA, health technology assessment kind of information, looking at the clinical data, but then trying to say, well, what would a value-based price be? So I'll be thinking about economic value from the standpoint of a market. Certainly social values like equity, we certainly hear a lot about that. It's a big topic in our field at the moment. But that's not particularly what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about more the economic value. And it's not just about new medicines. I mean, we can talk about what do we pay for physicians, what do we pay for hospitals, all those things have to do with economic value. But I'll be thinking mostly about the case of patent protected medicines. And the question for me is, well, do we bring them into the health benefit package or make them available to all citizens? And how, at what price do we pay for them, and what are we willing to reward the innovators for that? So I always think it's important. I always like to remind people that we have a very limited number of medicines that we produce each year. I looked yesterday, and so and you can see in 2021 it was 50. So there's no clear trend. Maybe you could argue there's a bit of a trend since 2016 in terms of the number of new novel drug approvals by the Food and Drug Administration. What I like to emphasize is these are high risk, high reward. Most of the drugs I worked on when I was in industry failed to make it to the market. 9 out of 10 times they fail. They're global public goods, and that's a bit of a loaded term, but in the economic sense that they represent information, and everyone in the world can benefit from that. And hence, one of the big issues for us is, as a professional society, is we would like for citizens all over the world to have access to these medicines, given that the marginal cost of making them is low. But but it's very costly, in the billions of dollars. We probably spend, more than $100 billion globally annually in R&D, and we're getting 50 medicines. So you can see it's a couple of billion per compound. And the companies have to recover that to stay in business. Now, there has been a change in recent years to more and more of these products are fast track, they're breakthroughs, and over half of them are for rare and orphan diseases. So that, to me, that's testimony to the science, but also the incentives. We see it, as I showed earlier, we have a large number of companies entering these spaces. Now, this is a step back slide to give my general perspective on what's going on. So this industry productivity has been pretty flat, even though we do invest more and more. You could argue in the last few years, so some evidence that because of that the investment, the cost of developing these gene therapies is less the expected cost because the science is better. So we have fewer failures, but it's not costless. But the cost per new entity has been rising. If we're going to cover that, we have to pay with higher prices. We all kind of object to higher prices. You may say, well, manufacturers have a license to print went off patent, we went out of business, and Roche bought us. So we didn't have a license to print money and stay in business. Development's moving towards these more specialized product. A lot of it's, I think, science driven. They represent, we've seen the sort of advent of cures with the drugs in hepatitis C, a concept we hadn't really experienced to that same level. But when we look across the empirically across what manufacturers are receiving versus the health gains, the correlation is not as strong as economists would like. So we have an alignment problem, and arguably the existence of ICER is testimony to the idea to try to bring some order to that. Now, the other thing that's going on is U.S. prices are much higher than other countries, 2 to 3 times. So that creates a lot of discomfort. The U.S. is funding, 40 to 50% of global R&D. And over the last, I would say, certainly we hear about it all the time that this doesn't seem fair to Americans that they're footing the bill for all of this R&D. And that's what, that's obviously something the sort of reforms in drug pricing are looking at the federal level. So, with these pressures over the last 10 years, ISPOR, we saw a plethora of what we call value assessment frameworks, and here are a few of them. I've circled ICER, which is the one I'll focus on, but the Heart Association, the cardiologist, and cancer associations and others have developed value frameworks. And now we formed a task force at ISPOR that I was a co-chair of health economists running through a review process that involved multiple stakeholders to try to understand these frameworks and what they mean. And I can talk about that at the end if we want. But the key thing here is we're going to focus on some of the work of ICER, and that was what motivated the paper that we developed. Now, again, this is a paragraph from our ISPOR task force. And our working premise was we really care about this because we care about the signals that are being sent to innovators. We want to tell them what we value and how we value it so they can efficiently improve health and welfare. If we give them the wrong signals, we're going to get a lot of activity on things that we don't value. So that's the rationale for trying to develop a good measure. Now, there are 3 key questions, which is, well, what are the elements of value? We use that. We've developed, it could be called components, dimensions. We've used the term elements. How do we measure them, provide evidence, and value them? And then how are they aggregated and judged to reach a decision on value? And usually that's done through a deliberative process. I mean, for example, I sit on a P&T committee here in the Northwest. It's very much clinically driven. It's not, although we do look at price currently, with so many of these products coming to market without the price being set, it's a difficult situation for the formulary committee. Now, a formulary committee in the U.S. is a bit of an HTA committee, but they don't normally consider price. I mean, the U.S. is, directly. The organization, the health insurance company, considers it, and through the negotiation with manufacturers about rebates. Now, again, coming back to what economists think of as value, we go back to microeconomic principles. And the value of something is what we're willing to pay for it or what we have to give up in terms of money or other things to get it. So the opportunity cost is a term that comes up. So that's the economic concept of value. Well, how do we think about that? Well, the way I think about it is it's what I'd be willing to pay or what I have to give up in the situation. But the implication of that is there's not some constant value of life or anything else that everybody has. We all value life differently. The value I place on life may change over time. So there's not just one number for everybody. It's difficult to measure this because we can't use markets because all of us have insurance. So not everybody has adequate insurance, but we're seldom making the full purchase ourselves as subsidized by someone else. So I'm not actually voting with my own dollars. Now, in theory, what you might imagine the exercise I would like to do as an economist is I would go to a 20-year-old and say, well, you're 20 years old, your life expectancy is about 80. You might need a heart transplant over the rest of your life, sometime in the rest of your life. We have some technologies for doing a heart transplant and then providing immunosuppression. After that, what would you be willing to pay in your incremental insurance premium over the rest of your life to include that in your benefit package? Well, the problem is, first of all, our average health spending in America is about over $10,000 a person now. So if you think about 80 years, your lifetime budget is $900,000. That's a big number. And the margin, the incremental cost of a heart transplant added to that would be tiny. And so you couldn't really answer the question. So I think we can't really ask that question. So instead, we've developed this methodology around the quality adjusted life year as kind of an crude approximation to let us think about how much we should reward for these innovations. Now, again, we got to think about these markets. I emphasize patent protected because for a patent protected medicine, that price can be negotiated at launch. Whereas the price of the surgeon, the price of the hospital day, those have been set administratively through Medicare and Medicaid and through other insurers in kind of a market, but it's different than that new product that's entering the market where we can negotiate the price. So how have we thought about this? We said, well, it's what you'd be willing to pay. So I would say, well, if you save me $100, I should be willing to pay you at least $99 for that. Maybe I'd like to get it for less, but that certainly any cost savings or what we call cost offsets matter. Okay, if you extend my life, that's valuable. I'm willing to pay something for that. And if you can improve my quality of life, reduce my morbidity, that's valuable. So those become the three components of the kind of what I would call conventional cost effectiveness analysis, which is the cost per quality, the cost utility analysis, as we call it. Okay, I'm not sure I'm getting my advance right now. Okay, now this is a diagram from the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. They have a value assessment framework that they've updated over time. They've been around for over 5 years now. And you can see that they express their goal as a fair price, fair access, and supporting future innovation. And down to the left, they try to assess value for money, and they do a thorough, I would say, thorough comparative clinical effectiveness. They try to look at all the clinical trials and all the comparators versus standard of care. And then that feeds into a cost effectiveness analysis. And that's what I'm calling conventional cost effectiveness analysis. And their base case is a cost per quality. And then they say, well, wait a second, on the lower left, but we recognize that may not incorporate other things. So we leave a couple of buckets here that we call other benefits and contextual considerations to consider other things. So they have a group process, they develop the analysis, they present it to stakeholder groups around the country, and then they get them to make a recommendation. Now, they've worked implicitly with a threshold, cost per quality threshold of saying, we're willing to pay $100,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year gain. So if a manufacturer comes with a product that will increase a person's quality adjusted life expectancy by 1 year, a fair price would be $150,000 for that. And that's the way they think. But then they have shown, because of other benefits and contextual considerations, they have made their deliberative process and stakeholder groups have sometimes recommended products that were at a higher price than that. And I would just say you can think about that, benchmark that on the average GDP per capita in America of about $65,000. So that's kind of between 2 and 3 times per capita GDP. So ICER, is an influential body, and is manufacturers are looking to them. Now, we've also had a couple of other things come out that I want to mention. One is we had a kind of a re-review of what was called the Panel on Cost Effectiveness in Health and Medicine. They did a report 20 years ago, headed by Peter Newman, who was and Jillian Sanders. Now they headed this review, and they published in 2016. And you probably can't read this diagram, but what the basic thing here, their basic point is, well, we list a whole lot of potential impacts. A number of them fall into what we call the health sector perspective, but then there's a broader societal perspective. And we're all living this with COVID-19. We understand that this disease is affecting education, criminal justice, education, housing, environment, and so on. So they sort of say, well, we need to do the assessment both from the narrow health sector perspective, what is the impact from the insurance plan, but also from the societal perspective. And this is what we've called the ISPOR value flower coming out of our report. And here are a number of petals that represent different elements of value that we identified. Now, we did not intend this to be the final word on value. We just wanted to point out that there are a lot of things that besides the quality and cost, which are at 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock. I mean, certainly we think about productivity at 3 o'clock. Family spillovers is the fact, it's kind of taking account of the fact that if I have a parent with Alzheimer's disease, then that affects my life. And then all these other blue ones are from going from 4 o'clock around till 11 o'clock. Those, a number of those are related to uncertainty. And we've criticized, our field is, so kind of self-critically said, the focus on the quality doesn't really deal adequately with uncertainty and the value of reducing uncertainty. And so we've added these value elements for that. And I think it's a very important thing. In fact, when I was from the 20 years ago when I was working at Roche and trying to look at the value of personalized medicine, that was the combination of the tests and the targeted therapy produces the value to the patient. So we want to kind of value that reduction in uncertainty. Okay, so let me turn now to the paper that this consensus group put together. And again, we had a number of people. Some people were within the company. Unicure funded it. We had an analysis group involved. We had Ed Pizzala, who's worked at Aetna for a long time. Adrian Taus is from the UK. And Michael Recht is really our key KOL on the clinical side. So we had a mixture, a multidisciplinary team. At the same time, ICER had come out with a general report saying, we're looking at these gene therapies. We're calling them single and short-term therapies. And, we need to adapt conventional CEA. So ICER was recognizing this, and they said, well, we need to think about we're now getting this advent of cures. So what does that mean? Maybe we need to think about adjusting our methodology for that. We need to model durability. I mean, these products are at launch. We don't know how long the benefits are going to last because we have a short-term trial. We can't wait 30 years to find out. I mean, the benefits outweigh the risk well enough that the regulator is willing to put some of these on the market. So we're going to have to measure them and see what happens. But that affects the value depends on the durability. So we have a problem there. How do we sort that out? And then, and especially in the case of hemophilia, where factor VIII, has cost a lot, is, the annual cost of factor VIII treatment, prophylactic factor VIII, is over $500,000 per year. So if you can save on that, the question is who should share in that savings? Society, should we reward the manufacturer for saving that? And then they also recognize some of the elements that the ISPOR value flower had, the value of hope, which is probably a poor label, but it's really the idea that in the way we operationalize it is that people would be willing to give up some life for the chance of getting a cure. So in the case of immunotherapy, where we've seen a cure fraction, 30-40% of the patients actually are cured, but we don't know which, at the outset, we don't know who those people are, but it gives value to hope of everybody. Now, real option value is another idea that if I treat you in an area where there's a lot of innovation and extend your life, you'll benefit from that innovation. So, so those are other factors, and they recognize that we need to start thinking about those. So I'm not going to read this slide to you. I'm going to go through each of these. We looked at 6 methodological areas for improvement and challenges. The first we called immaturity of evidence and the cure definition. So, the thing is, ICER, and we use this in the paper, had reviewed Valrox, a gene therapy for a gene therapy for hemophilia A, the first product, I guess. And I've, by the way, just again a disclosure, I was involved in an analysis funded by BioMarin to look at that, and we have a separate publication that you could compare with what ICER's model was. But I won't say a lot about that unless asked. But so I was involved in that modeling. And we had to make assumptions about, the rate of decline of effect, about durability. How many years would this last in a patient? Now, the thing is, these models were developed. ICER did a review, but then all of this was put on hold by the FDA, who requested 2 more years of data. And I just would point out that the durability issue might be different in hemophilia A and hemophilia B. Hemophilia B may have more evidence of durable effect. Now, so the problem is there are limited follow-up data, and there's no consensus definition of a cure. And we have to collect these data real world, and then say, well, we collect these data, then how does that affect what we're willing to pay? Now, I would say everything else equal, if I have uncertainty, I'm going to say to the manufacturer, well, you haven't proven to me that I'm going to get a lifetime of benefit. You haven't proven to me that that's a cure. I'm not going to pay for it as if it were a cure. We're going to have a discounted price for this. Now, you may know that I think ICER assumed about $2 million in this realm as an upfront payment. And I think that's what we assumed in our modeling that I did. And which is not, I guess the benchmark here is the spinal muscular atrophy, that the Zolgensma for that was priced at about, priced at 2.125 million, which provided a benchmark that people are starting to think about. Let's put it that way. Okay, so the other problem is, and I think the Zolgensma case is the one I know the best. It was essentially a single. Once we had confidence that the gene therapy was a good alternative, we really, it's difficult to randomize children or infants to that treatment. So we end up with single arm trials. And if we want to assess the comparative effectiveness, how do we do that if we didn't have a randomized controlled trial? So the obvious things are to look at real world data and look at historical data to try to compare to historical data, but not many times we haven't collected the right historical data. So our group was saying, well, we do need to make these comparisons. The ICER ICER will try to make a comparison as best it can. We'll make assumptions. And so ideally and again, it's important to emphasize the difference between comparative effectiveness and clinical efficacy. Now, again, things going through the FDA and EMA are telling us about clinical efficacy in a controlled setting. As health economists and as payers to health plans, we're concerned about what is effectiveness in the real world and how does it compare to the standard of care. And so we want to make a projection of comparative effectiveness to do value. So it's always a projection. You can't. Oftentimes these analyses are done at launch and you'll see a publication and therefore product X is cost effective. I usually have to say, no, we haven't shown it's cost effective. We haven't followed people for 10 years. What we've shown is we have a projection of potential cost effectiveness. So I'm pretty careful to always try to label papers as assessing the potential cost effectiveness. Now, again, there are ethical issues here, logistical issues, and it's going to be difficult to do indirect treatment comparisons. The key thing about these rare conditions is it becomes kind of less costly to develop a registry versus some highly prevalent chronic condition. And so hopefully that, there'll be more, I think there should be more of that activity happening. And that will be useful for assessing down the road, assessing what the value is and adjusting the value. Now, the other big issue is, how do I measure? Another big issue is clinical and patient-centric outcomes. Now, our ICER uses an instrument called the EQ5D. So that means there are 5 dimensions and there are currently 5 levels to those dimensions. And so you'll get patients in trial will look at those dimensions and click off on the 5 dimensions where they stand. And so then the methodology is we apply weights to those responses based on what the general population says about those things, okay? And that produces a utility value on a scale of 0 to 1. And I just went back and looked at the paper that we did, and we estimated over a lifetime, I think, that the mean utility level for a patient, hemophilia A patient on factor 8 was about 0.73 over a lifetime. That was the average utility level, okay? Now I contrast that with my experience, and that's about the same as the utility level of a renal transplant or heart transplant patient, much better than a dialysis patient, but it's still below 1. Now the problem we run into in the field is who do you ask about the utility level? And on the one hand, you really do care about how it's affecting patients, but there's the disability paradox is patients tend to rate their health status higher than the general population. So if I do this vignette and I tell the general population what life with hemophilia A is like in terms of frequent injections, risk, bleeds, still some bleeds, joint damage, and so on, the general population will rate that quality of life lower than patients who have been coping with that. So the question is, well, what do you use in your analysis? And our field said, well, when it's coming to making societal policy decisions, we should use what the general population says, but we need to have a good vignette that tells them what life is really like. Now, there's a literature on something called core outcome sets, and there are 3 of them I'll mention. One called Core Hem that was developed by an organization, CMTP, which I think has sunsetted, but that the Core Hem is still around and it's a multidimensional description of life on hemophilia. There are people who've done something called Goal Hem, which has to do more aspirational, and then more recently, Mark Skinner and Brian Mahoney have developed a hemophilia value framework. And these are much more complex and descriptive than the quality. So if I'm a regulator, I want to look at these to sort of say what's happening to patients who are hemophilia patients. And then are they, do the benefits outweigh the risk? I'm not so much going to use the quality, but I can't use these things very easily for pricing and saying, well, how big of a reward should I give to one company versus another? But we do mapping from these kinds of the disease-specific instruments to the utility level, and that to try to fill in the gaps. And that's a challenge for our field. And I think I'll say more about that in a second. Now, as you all know, I mean, hemophilia, treatment of hemophilia has been, a factor VIII has essentially been a cure for a disease that if you didn't get that, you would probably die at a very young age and a difficult death. So we've paid a lot for that. But the question is, okay, if I come with a gene therapy that saves me all that costs over the rest of the patient's life, how big of a reward should I give to the company for avoiding all those costs? Now, our field would say, well, we do need to look at the lifetime cost of treatment. And I would say at this point, ICER didn't reach a consensus on this, and there's no consensus in the field on how to deal with this. And but so we didn't reach a consensus as part of this document. I have my own views, and this is from a paper that I put together on talking about the lifetime costs. And you can look down here at as I mentioned, on the left we have spinal muscular atrophy, and Zolgensma is what's labeled OA. And so the lifetime cost of a child, I think this is type 1, was estimated at $4 million. Now, again, the upfront cost was $2.125 million. Once you look at the remaining costs, it's $4 million. The next 4 columns have to do with hemophilia, and you can see that the costs of patients on inhibitors, a very small number of people, over a lifetime, ICER estimated to be over $100 million. And then we come down to the right and looking at a factor VIII at maybe $19 million over a lifetime, knowing that the average cost per year is over $500,000. So we shouldn't be surprised by that number. It's $18 million, okay? And then here are some other medicines that are life-saving or that they're also in this range. So we're talking about, for very rare conditions, saving people's lives, we're willing to spend tens of millions of dollars. And in fact, the government has an index that basically says that the value of a life for government policymaking is about $10 million. So it's not out of the ballpark. Now, the question is, well, what are we willing to pay at launch for these things, given these uncertainties, and we don't know about the durability of effect? Well, one way to do it is to write a contract that says, well, you tell me it's going to last for 10 years. If it doesn't last for 10 years, then you give me some money back. Well, the trouble is, in our fragmented U.S. healthcare system, we don't have a central payer. It's not easy to make that contract because, there's churn in the private insurance market, and then there's everybody goes to Medicare eventually. I'm on Medicare. But the prospect of registries opened the door. And, even Zolgensma sort of had spaced out the payments over several years and it's just a very, and there have been a number of these, and there are whole talks on this issue about outcomes-based contracting, but you can't do them without having good data systems. And we don't have a centralized repository of medical data in this country. We're all piecing together claims data. We have organizations trying to market and develop new data systems, but we're far from having a real-time data system that tells us what happens. Now, the perspective matters. And again, we argue and agree with ICER that we need to do a healthcare perspective and a societal perspective. And ICER relies primarily on the value-based price and then makes that presentation to a stakeholder group, and then they offer a judgment. So there is a deliberative process involved. Not all HTA bodies consider both, and the NICE in the UK focuses on the health service perspective and the value-based price. And the base case for ICER for the value-based price is also the healthcare perspective. But the societal perspective, I think we all would recognize this. And again, in the case of COVID, the question is, what if we only paid Moderna and Pfizer for the qualities gained and didn't say, these vaccines have also helped us to get children back to school earlier. So we've diminished the what we would call human capital loss. I mean, there are a lot of other societal aspects to COVID-19, and should we have made the prize larger to reflect the fact that there's more to it than just saving lives and healthcare costs? And Well, the fact is we didn't, I don't know that we did that or not. We'll have to see what history writes. So let me, we've got about 15 minutes. So let me just wrap up the paper. And the argument of our consensus group was we need to refine the hemophilia value assessment framework. And we need to model durability and reach it. We need to work on this definition of a cure and how we would bring in clinical expert input. We need to address quality of life issues, in particular around, the value of avoiding injections over a lifetime, or, the treatment over a lifetime, work with synthetic controls. One way to deal with these quality of life, the EQ5D is insensitive. And again, I'm talking about using the EQ5D primarily for pricing purposes. When it comes to assessing the impact of therapy on patients, I want something more patient-centric, like the value framework that I mentioned, the most recent one, and CoreHem. We need to develop data on costs, and I'm involved in some projects where people have tried to estimate the costs of, and it's not as simple as you think to sort of get out of our claims system, but the cost of factor VIII treatment, it obviously varies for different types of products and people, but it's well over 500,000 a year, maybe closer to 600,000 on average. We need to keep being creative about outcomes-based contracting, and we need to look at both the payer and societal perspectives. Now, I have some slides on broader issues, but why don't I stop there, Brett? And and I probably may have already made a number of the points I would make, and we can have questions, and I could run through those if there's time. But let's go to a discussion, and I look forward to hearing what you all think about this and what I can learn from you. Thank you.
Sounds good, Lou. Thank you. It was a great presentation so far, and we do have several questions that have come in, so I'll start right at the top here. First question is, from a traditional perspective, we've approached this from the market will bear this amount. Is that really how we should be approaching pricing for gene therapy in that way, given that the per person price will likely exceed $2 million?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, again, I think, at least so the work that we did and that ICER did basically said even at $2 million, it would be cost reducing because you would save so much on factor VIII and you would improve patients' quality of life. Now, the models assume that basically the life expectancy of hemophilia patients is the same as the general population, which is testimony, makes it very different than Zolgensma, for example, which the child dies within 2 years, so you save a life. But here, most of the gain, and I think it came out in our model, to about 3/4 of a life year of quality of life improvement by avoiding some of the side effects of factor VIII therapy. But I mean, our system is basically, and the system for drug R&D is, we give you a patent, which means we're saying to you, normally we don't like monopolies. We have antitrust laws against monopolies, but we're going to make an exception for a limited period to let you be a monopolist. And we know that you're going to try to behave like a monopolist. So you're going to try to charge us what the market will bear. Now we have to decide, well, what will we bear? What are we willing to pay? And that's what ICER is saying. Well, we should not be willing to pay $1 million per quality. They're saying, well, we should only be willing to pay $150,000 per quality. That's what they argue that the market should bear. So the answer is, but I think we've got to recognize that especially in the case of Hatch-Waxman and small molecules, the idea was, look, we know that your patent is limited to 20 years. It's going to take you 8 to 12 years to get to the market through all the regulatory. So you're only going to be a monopolist for a limited time. Okay. And at the end of that, you're going to have to go generic, just like Lipitor, again, most prescribed drug in America. I think it was developed from like 1996 to 2011. It's been off patent, since 2011. It cost me $4 a year. So I'm getting all the surplus, so what we would call consumer surplus from that. And Pfizer's not getting any more for that, even though Pfizer, probably prior to Sovaldi and Hep C, Pfizer got the biggest prize of all time in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars for atorvastatin. Okay. So that's not to say that now the other big thing you got to we all understand from the standpoint of the company. Imagine that you have an asset that's bringing in billions of dollars a year. Every day means tens of millions of dollars to you. So you're going to try to maneuver in the system as best you can to create, to block entry, to behave as a profit maximizing company. So we have to provide safeguards and regulation to permit, to prohibit abuse of that market power. And, certainly generic, and it's going to be really interesting because we haven't really, I mean, you all are probably aware that we've had this for small molecules, we've had Hatch-Waxman and they go off patent. But when it came to biologics, we've had to develop a policy around biosimilars to promote competition to essentially allow a generic entry, the equivalent of generic entry for biosimilars. The question remains, well, what are we going to do for these gene therapies? And we haven't really addressed, when did their patent expire and when do they have to become generic and how do we manage that? And that's a big policy issue that we need to address in the coming years.
Great.
Hope that was to the topic, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Appreciate that. Next question that comes in. Quality of life is difficult to measure, especially in people with chronic conditions. How is the quality established within the bleeding disorders community?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's this whole issue, as I'm sure you're all aware about. People are concerned that the quality is somehow biased against disabled people. Okay, and there's mathematically, technically, you could argue that, but I don't think it's been applied that way in the real world. And the question is, well, what is the alternative? How do I decide how much to give a company for gene therapy versus paying somebody for a new diabetes drug or a new heart drug? What's my alternative? I mean, and so we have to come up with some sort of a proxy to sort of say, well, and so what we say is, look, the value is if you extend life or improve quality of life, and I'll use these metrics, that'll let me make a comparison. And if you save me money, I can take that into account. So that's kind of how we decide the relative value, under the understanding when it comes to medicines that you're going to, eventually it's going to become generic and you're going to get, you're no longer going to be a monopolist or an oligopolist. And, even in the case, I mean, even when you think about, statins, where we had so many entries. I mean, Zocor was the winner at the beginning, but then atorvastatin came along and took away their market. So it's not as though the monopoly is a license to print money. If somebody comes with a better, all these companies are making these bets on these gene therapies, but they may not have the best one. And 9 times out of 10, historically, drugs failed into the pipeline. So there's a tremendous risk on the side of the industry from that. And so we've got to figure, we're trying to balance that. Not sure, Brett, if I got off topic there.
Yeah, no.
Let me come back to the quality. So yeah,
sure.
I'm a proponent of using the quality, but we need to adjust it for these other factors, especially related to uncertainty. And I prefer to adjust that by saying raising the threshold. I mean, the way I look at it, and I've always, like, for example, the way I've thought about it for a long time is the big problem, as you all know, in America, we've had, 10% of the population uninsured. Now, in theory, those people who are uninsured could go to the emergency room and get treated, and they do, and they probably get there late and they don't get as good an outcomes. But we've had that fallback for them, but they're living in fear of bankruptcy. If they go to the emergency room and then they get the bill, it charges that they're going to be bankrupt. So it's kind of that fear of bankruptcy, that uncertainty that creates disutility. And that's kind of what we're saying. I think that those same principles apply here. And the one I like to think about is, and with COVID-19, so 2 years ago, if you were like me, you were pretty miserable at the prospect of thinking, my God, here comes a pandemic with a virus that could kill me, and I have no idea if we'll be able to do anything about it. So we were all worse off from the moment that we knew that we had the alpha version of coronavirus. But then when we came with the vaccines, we were all better off just knowing that there was something that could be done. So my utility, if you were rational, your utility went up. Your happiness level went up once you knew that we had things we could do about this. All right. So I think the same thing here. So if it's like, imagine the world before we had factor VIII. I mean, any parent was at risk of having a child born with hemophilia A. There was nothing very good that we could really do about it. But once we had a factor VIII, then all of us, not just the people who happened to have children who had hemophilia A, but we're all at risk of having children or grandchildren. So we're all better off. And so we got to think about that. And if we just count the qualities and the gain in the people we treat, we're not taking account of the aggregate value that we all get from reducing uncertainty.
Yeah. That's a great point. Thank you. We got another question that comes in, a great question actually, from Lawrence over in the UK. Lawrence starts off by saying, thanks, Dr. Garrison. This was a high-class presentation. The HTA process is complex, and a lot of these discussions are often occurring behind closed doors between a small group of stakeholders. How can the general community members engage in these discussions at a level that is understandable and to help shape the advocacy efforts for access to these expensive novel technologies?
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence, and for your kind words too. Now, I will just say I avoid the word expensive just because it has the connotation that it's not good value for money. So, I'm thinking we can spend $2 million, and yes, quote unquote, it's expensive in a budgetary sense, but it could be good value for money. So I would avoid using the word expensive. But no, I think everybody's recognizing, and I think all these deliberative processes in the developed in most countries, I mean, it's not just in Europe and the US, we all have room for stakeholder engagement. I mean, ICER has a stakeholder panel. We're all voters. You have an advocacy group, and you're intervening in our. It's very complicated to intervene given that Medicare, Medicaid, commercial payers, the quite complicated system we have. We don't have a centralized HTA decision. So you have to really engage with multiple stakeholders and multiple levels, and it's all the way down to the state decision to federal. It's just incredibly complicated. Now, I mean, the UK has citizens councils, and they have stakeholder engagement, and anyone who's running a public group normally invites stakeholders from advocacy groups to participate in the discussion, and that's certainly true at ICER, for example, as a prototype. But I think everybody realizes in the end that there's what we call in our technically a deliberative process for reaching the decision. It's not some economist who says, here's the exact number, that's going to work. And in fact, ICER's numbers are not binding on anybody. And the empirical evidence I've seen is that payers in America don't necessarily follow their numbers, So it's still, I don't know if that helps, but that's, I think that there is a room for advocacy. And I think, the trouble is every disease has an advocacy group. And so how do we then decide where to put our money in terms of R&D? And I mean, that's what we're talking about. If we set the big rewards for hemophilia gene therapy, then that's where we'll see the R&D go. And that's important. But what about, are there other areas that are being ignored,
Right. No, it's a great point. Thanks, Lou. Next question that comes in, for high cost therapies, how do we as a community and society ensure that access to these innovative therapies are equitable and accessible to all who need them? Kind of along the same lines there.
Well, what I would say to you is when 10% of the people, I don't know what, fortunately, the Affordable Care Act reduced the number of uninsured. By definition, we don't have an equitable system. Okay. And so apparently citizens don't value equity above everything. So Brett, repeat the wording of the question again. It was a good wording. I mean, just how do we ensure that they're equitable? I mean, I think we're trying to look at, I think our field is looking at health equity. And I think the COVID-19 made it very clear, given that there were differential death rates by ethnic groups, race groups, income groups, that the disease was not affecting us equitably. And we couldn't really justify it. So there's been a big push in our field to try to look more explicitly at equity. But I think we've all realized all along that there are tremendous inequities in the country. There's tremendous variability. And John Wenberg showed 40, 50 years ago that there was tremendous spending variability across the country, utilization of procedures variability, that there's not, equity is not the number one goal of America. Let me put it that way. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lou. And next question comes in from Aaron. Hello, Aaron. How are you? Len, you might want to chime in on this one as well, too. But Aaron starts off by saying, thank you, Dr. Garrison, for your time and expertise. I question whether, given the economics and uncertainty involved with gene therapy, like huge costs, significant risks, and limited time frame of efficacy, wouldn't the community be better served by focusing efforts and funding on research gears towards a cure rather than a Band-Aid?
Well, I guess I guess the question is, the thing is that gene therapy for scientific reasons, to me, has the prospect of being a cure. So, that's where that seems to me that the market is responding and saying we have the technologies that might be a cure, and that's where we're headed. So, I mean, there are a lot of cynics about the industry who would say, well, these guys have had cures sitting on the shelf and they just don't put them out because it'll destroy their markets. Well, I mean, look at Sovaldi and Hep C. What happened? I mean, we went, and I'd worked at Roche on Pegasus, which was pegylated interferon, which, was, improved people's lives and saved lives, but was nothing, but when Sovaldi came along, it essentially knocked that pegylated interferon out of business. So there's an example where the industry did come forward with cures. Okay. Now they, this was, so they did come forward with cures, and this is Gilead. And again, in disclosure, I'm involved in some work with Gilead in this area, but, so they came through with a cure, and so they don't just let it sit on the shelves. And if there's a powerful incentive to put it out there, we just need to be sure that we've incentivized it. And I think there's a problem, and there's a question, are we incentivizing? I mean, I think of it as kind of 4 buckets: short-term therapies, like you get a hip replacement, or chronic therapies like insulin for type 1 diabetes, also, which is in a sense a cure. If you don't get that, you die. Okay, whereas it's not so clear with atorvastatin that if I don't take my atorvastatin, I'll never know if I died for that reason or not. And then there are these one-time administration, SMA extreme case, that if the child dies within 2 years if we don't treat them, and we're trying to balance incentives across those different kinds of technologies. And right now we have this crude approximation where we say, okay, well, we're going to pay for quality's gain. Now, you can imagine a world, and this is totally imaginary, it's a reductio ad absurdum, where basically we just said to companies, okay, if you come through the FDA, we'll give you $10 billion and you have to make it generic tomorrow. Okay, so there's no renegotiation of price, but that it's not really practical, I mean, to try to do that. But it would be called the patent buyout world. It'd be a pure prize system where I give you a prize, and then we buy it out and it becomes generic, and then anybody in the world has access to it, and we can have generic manufacturers all over competing and make, and you can imagine that world, but we're not there. We don't know how to run that competition. There were improvements to Sovaldi and Hep C by the other direct acting antivirals after that were actually better. And if we'd just bought out Sovaldi, would we have gotten those? So, but you've got to understand, and we're trying to approximate a system that encourages innovation, and it's a crude approximation. And so we say we're going to reward the people who give us the most value with the most money, but we're not going to give them that reward for the next 2,000 years. We're going to say you just get it until your patent expires, and then we're going to try to make it generic and let everybody benefit.
Dr. Valentino from NHF here is with us as well too. Len, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think the real question comes in terms of the definition of cure, and that could be very subjective to different individuals. And recently I had a man with severe hemophilia tell me that in his estimation, when he first got factor VIII replacement, that was a cure for him. So I think that we have to think about this on an individual basis as well as a community and societal basis on what defines a cure. And it may not be the same for every individual with hemophilia as to how they value that, whether it's complete resolution of their symptoms, or it's, for example, in gene editing, that they no longer have the ability to transmit the disease. So I think that the whole definition of cure still requires some work.
No, that's a great point. And I have my working definition, and I think of factor VIII as being a near cure. I mean, people's life, if we're in it, and I don't know if there are probably people participating in this who know the data better than I do, but the people in our field were willing to assume that once you are on factor VIII, you have the life expectancy of an average citizen. So that's a near cure from my point of view. I think about it as that we all have a lifetime trajectory of a probability of, at some point we're probably going to die, before age 90. And, we have utility level over our whole lifetime, and that's a trajectory. So at birth, I have a trajectory, the average trajectory for the population. And as you get older, your utility level falls because you have chronic conditions, you're approaching death and you die. Okay, to me, a cure is something that gets me back on that trajectory.
Right.
Now, factor VIII doesn't get me back perfectly on that trajectory because I still have quality of life deficits related to the bleeds, related to the joint issues, related to the injections, but I'm pretty much almost back on that trajectory. So I would agree with that individual who said from his point of view, that was pretty much a cure. He got 90%.
Right.
He almost got back on their trajectory. Now, obviously, every person is, as I said at the beginning, every person has different values of life and makes different choices. I mean, we're seeing it on COVID, right? And willingness to get vaccinated or not is different valuations of health and other risks. So, but yeah, no, I think well, I have my definition. I haven't sold the field on it, but my definition is getting back on that lifetime trajectory. It's a simple-minded kind of thing. And that's so in other words, if I have an automobile accident and they I break an arm and they fix it, I'm back on my trajectory. It's a cure. It got me back on the trajectory. So it's a minor cure. It's not a chronic condition that was going to lead to lots of life year loss, but anyway, that's how I think about it, but I haven't sold the field on it. But you're right. We have to. I don't know. We'll have to see if that stands up.
Yeah. Thank you for a great presentation.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Garrison. We
I'm
appreciate
sorry I ran over. I didn't even get. Let me just put up this one slide.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to tell people. Okay. You down the left, I talk about decision context, and I think what I've done on the right were the value frameworks, and I just like to tell people that. As economists, we're mostly talking about cost effectiveness and negotiating price, but there's also benefit management, guidelines, and then there's shared decision making between the physician and the patient. You've got to think about those as different decision contexts, and then there's the regulatory. So, we're not saying the quality works equally well in all of those. In fact, the disease-specific instruments like the Hemophilia Value Framework, CoreHem, are more appropriate, especially down at the patient level or in the regulatory level. So I just want to make that point about decision context. So I can stop there, Brett. I know I'm over. I appreciate everybody's attention, and feel free to write to me. I can go to I have my email address here at the back. Now, the other point I wanted to make is our field is trying to make the case for solving the problem of this uncertainty. And we argue that it creates cost effectiveness threshold. So I could say for hemophilia A, my threshold is higher than 150,000 per quality because of the uncertainty involved in that. And that's essentially what this developed out of our value flower work. We've developed some mathematics of justifying a higher threshold, and would argue that it also adjusts for the discrimination that we might see against disabled people when it comes to the quality. So that's cutting edge work that people in our field are working on. And I'm happy to share information on that if you want to write to me. So again, thanks everybody for the attention. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing your contact information. We appreciate it. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time and to join us this afternoon and sharing your presentation. Please note that this recorded webinar will be available on Friday, January 7th at hemophilia.org under the events tab. And thanks again, Dr. Garrison, for joining us. We appreciate it. Just a great presentation. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Good luck.
Thanks.